What's happening at the Missouri History Museum? Details next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter. Welcome to City Corner. Today we're going to let you know what's happening right now at the Missouri History Museum. Just not what's happening, but what's coming up. And I'd like you to welcome our first guest. That's Jody Sal. He's the Managing Director of Strategic Initiatives.
Sure, it's a long title.
That's a big title. Jody, what does that mean? What are strategic initiatives?
Well, that means that I am in charge of sort of directing the long-term strategy for the museum and then making sure that we communicate that out on shows like yours when we're lucky enough.
We'll try to do some communication right now. Let's talk a little bit about the museum in general. It is really a treasure located in Forest Park. It has a long history. It's an incredible building with permanent exhibits that change from time to time. Historically, what can you tell me about it?
That's right. So the Missouri Historical Society was founded in 1866. The building that you know there in Forest Park was built in 1913. Many people think that it was there for the World's Fair.
I was going to say that.
It was not, so we're helping you on your trivia quizzes. But it was built with proceeds from the fair, and it was the first monument to Thomas Jefferson in the country. And then the more modern part of the building that people see from the back when they're entering from Forest Park, that came about in the year 2000. That more than doubled our exhibit space and our programming space. Interestingly, so 1866, that's 153 years old. In just the last 6 years, we've opened 8 of our 10 most visited exhibits in that history. So we're doing some pretty exciting exhibits at the History Museum right now.
Well, Jody, you know, there are a lot of museums around. What makes the Missouri History Museum so unique, do you think?
You know, I think our focus on St. Louis and that sort of deep focus on St. Louis is really something that you can't find at any other museum in the city in the way that we do, and really is pretty unique for history museums across the country. A lot of history museums across the country rely on these big traveling shows that tell national stories. We take those. We'll talk about one of those in just a minute. But we really put a focus on St. Louis history. We say that we will introduce people to a St. Louis they've never met, whether they've lived here all their lives or have just become part of the community.
Maybe you did a little tease for us. Coming up in the second segment of this program, we're going to talk to a couple of other people involved with the museum. Tell me a little bit about them and what they've come to share with us.
Sure. So you are going to hear about a really exciting project about the Mississippi River. So you're going to hear about a book that I think is one of the best books about Mississippi River history that's ever been published, and one of the best books about St. Louis history that's ever been published. That's called Great River City.
And that's just out, isn't it?
It's coming out in November 1st. Mm-hmm. And then you will also hear about what is a pretty amazing exhibit that we have coming up called Mighty Mississippi. Includes more than 200 artifacts, tells you about Mississippi River history from mound builders up to today. You know, the Mississippi River runs through every chapter of St. Louis history, but sometimes we manage to forget that. You won't forget that starting in November.
That's amazing. How many people work on the exhibits you have? It must be like this. We're not talking about a couple of people.
Right. It takes a whole team. We're about to talk about photojournalism and newspapers. It obviously takes a whole team of people to get out a morning newspaper. It also takes a whole team of people to put together an exhibit. You have the people who are writing the labels and the people who are editing the labels, the people who are creating the media, the people who are building the risers. Every piece of an exhibit really requires a whole team.
Okay, you specifically are going to talk to us about, I think, 3 different things. Are these permanent exhibits?
No, these are a few temporary exhibits that we have. 2 of those are in the same gallery, by the way. It's sort of like 2 exhibits in one. That's Pulitzer Prize photographs. That exhibit comes to us from the museum in Washington, D.C. And in focus, St. Louis Post-Dispatch photographs, which was made possible through a partnership with the Post.
What are we looking at? To take it, this is inside the museum.
So this is an intro to the Pulitzer Prize photographs exhibit. This is the largest collection of Pulitzer Prize photographs ever gathered in one space. You'll see 80 photos on the wall. You'll see more than 1,000 on interactive kiosks. I can tell you if that photo to the very left, sort of in the distance, I don't know if your viewers will be able to tell, but that's a cab of a tractor trailer that's falling off of a bridge. And the photographer for that was Virginia Shao. She was the first woman to ever win a Pulitzer for photojournalism. She's also an example of an amateur who won. She was driving, she sees this accident. Her husband gets out to help rescue the two people who are in the cab of the truck dangling above the river. She grabs her Kodak Brownie camera. It only has 2 frames left in it. She hadn't shot it in more than a year. She grabs that, she shoots this photo, she sends it to the Sacramento Bee because the Sacramento Bee has a Photo of the Week competition. If you win, you get $10. She not only won the $10, but she won a Pulitzer. It's stories like that, these sort of behind-the-scenes stories of some of the most iconic photos in the history of the United States that you will find in that Pulitzer Prize photographs.
Yeah. So I was just going to ask that question. These are not just Missouri or St. Louis photographs. These are from across the country.
Right, and around the world. So I say in this show you'll see all sorts of history, maybe more history than we've ever packed into one exhibit, because we're not just focusing on one place like the Mississippi River or one time like 1904 in the World's Fair. We're telling the story through the lens of photojournalists. So you get labor history, you get immigration history, you get civil rights history, history of war, history of healthcare, all packed into one. And because of that, you'll see some of those iconic photos that you know or remember where you were when. You'll see the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. You'll see the funeral of Martin Luther King. You'll see the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald by Dallas bar owner Jack Ruby. These photos that have become iconic, you will learn the stories behind them.
Do you think we won't recognize every photo, though?
Not everyone. Something like that Virginia Shao photo, a lot of people probably haven't seen. So it's a mix of both those photos that you know and have become iconic, and some that will be surprising or maybe that you have forgotten.
And how did you collect all these?
Well, so these come from the museum, and that's been their mission, is to tell the history of journalism and photojournalism. And so they did that part. And for most museums, that's been enough. That show is so powerful that most museums have just put up that show. But as I mentioned earlier, we try to tell the St. Louis story. So what we did is we said we want to do something more for our visitors. So we partnered with the Post-Dispatch to do the St. Louis Post-Dispatch photo show. That more than doubles the size of this show. So there are 80 photos in the Pulitzer exhibit. There's 77, I think, in the Post-Dispatch one. In that one, where we really did curate the selection of photos, we worked closely with the Post-Dispatch. We told them that we really wanted a diversity of photos over time and topic, and that's really how we curated those.
I don't remember when the Post-Dispatch originally launched.
1878, so
I knew you would know
December
that.
12th, 1878. And they have won 19 Pulitzers over their time, 2 for photojournalism, the most recent for their coverage of Ferguson. That coverage, by the way, they won not just for a singular image, which you sometimes do. The Virginia Shao photo, that was a singular image, but you can also win for a portfolio of images. So the Post-Dispatch won for their full portfolio of 19 images from Ferguson. You'll see them all in that show.
How much does it help you that the Post-Dispatch has such a storied history and fine reputation? Not every city, I'm guessing, maybe would be blessed with the type of things the Post-Dispatch has in their history.
That's true. They really have captured the first draft of St. Louis history. They've captured incredibly Big moments, some that have been lost to time. So one photo you will see in the Post-Dispatch show is a photo of the 1943 glider crash. You might be familiar with the story, but many of my visitors aren't. Robertson Aircraft was showing off a new glider.
Was that at Lambert?
Yes, and so they invited St. Louisans, hundreds, thousands of St. Louisans were there to see it. They filled it with city leaders. So the city's mayor was there, head of Chamber of Commerce, lawyers and judges. Almost immediately when it gets in the air, a wing falls off and it crashes to the ground, killing everyone on board. It wasn't just a huge aviation disaster, it was a civic disaster to lose your city's power structure. Because the Post-Dispatch was there to cover it, and because those photos have been preserved, we're able to share those stories, many of which would be forgotten if it wasn't for the work of photojournalists.
And what do you do as far as the exhibit to help us understand what we're seeing?
So each one has a label that gives you a full story of what was happening. It really is, like, each individual image has its own story. Some are fascinating, some are tragic, some are funny. But that's really how we do. The experience is that you really can get into all of those more than 150 photos and learn everything about them. And we see some visitors who, zoom through and find the photo that captures their interest. And we see others that do it almost factory line style, reading every story for every photo. That's how my oldest daughter approaches museums. So
really, she reads everything?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you have anything to do with that, or?
I don't know. I would like to think.
So is it a learning process then? To see this, to go to it?
Absolutely. So it can also be a difficult process.
Why?
Some of these images are very hard to look at. One early reviewer for the Pulitzer show said many of these images are hard to look at and hard to look away from. So you see what wins the Pulitzer, the top prize in photojournalism, is oftentimes the hardest news that we have to see, whether it be 9/11 or the Oklahoma City bombing.
You know, that Jack Ruby picture you mentioned is one that sticks in my head, is just capturing a horrific second.
Exactly, and it is an example of a photographer, and you see this throughout, who thought he had missed the most important photo that he would ever take in his life. So that was Robert Jackson. He was a photographer for the Dallas Times-Herald, and he was in the Kennedy motorcade during the assassination. He saw a rifle pointing out of the book depository, but he was changing his film, and so did not get that image. Wow. 2 days later, he gets a Jack Ruby.
I don't think you've mentioned the History Made display. That's a separate thing, isn't it?
It is. So that is a totally different topic and completely new. This is 4 cases with more than 20 artifacts from the Blues Stanley Cup championship winning season. You will see, if you have a favorite player, you will probably see something from them, whether it be Maroon or O'Reilly or Tarasenko. My favorite part you see in the background there, the case to the right, that's all about Game 7 of the Stanley Cup. In it, you will see the 4 pucks that went in the net for the Blues. They won 4-1. You will see each puck that made history. And you will also see Jordan Bennington's pads and blockers and glove. And look closely, because on those, you will see the puck marks of the Boston Bruins, who tried to score but only got 1 goal that game. Wow. And so you see those marks on his blocker, on his pads. It's pretty great to see.
Pretty timely now that the hockey season's getting ready to
Pretty
gear up.
Exactly, and that will run through the All-Star Game. People may not know the All-Star Game will be held in St. Louis this year. I think that's the first time that a Stanley Cup winning city has also hosted the All-Star Game.
So the Pulitzer Prize, the In Focus Post-Dispatch photos, and the History Made display, these are all temporary ones, right?
They're all temporary. So the Pulitzer Prize and In Focus show runs through January 20th of 2020. That's Martin Luther King Day. And the History Made St. Louis Blues display, that'll run through the All-Star Game. So basically end of January, around January 26th.
All right. Well, Jody, thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Thank you for having me.
There's always something exciting at the Missouri History Museum, that's for sure.
We like to think so.
And you mentioned a few things we're going to talk about coming up, so we'll do that. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with more about the Missouri History Museum right after this. I'm Steve Potter. Welcome back to City Corner. Today we're talking about what's going on at the Missouri History Museum, and there's always something exciting going on. They're permanent exhibits that change from time to time, and we're picking up on that right now. I'd like you to welcome my guest. To my immediate right is David Logig of the museum, and to his right is Andrew Wanko. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm glad you could be here. Andrew, let me start with you. You are a public historian at the
That's
museum.
right. Yeah.
What kind of job is that?
Yeah, so I always like to tell people I'm like a curator, but they don't let me touch anything. Basically, you know, if a traditional museum curator spends time caring for artifacts and caring for the collections that we have, my job instead is to find ways to bring that history to life for the general public. So be that through exhibits, through media like this, through blog posts. I've done a feature-length documentary for the museum. Anything we can think of to bring local history to life for St. Louisans, that's my job.
And you wrote a book, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes.
Yes, right.
Yeah. David, what about you? You are curator of environmental life.
Well, that means I care for the collection that pertains to how people live in the environment, natural resource use. St. Louis is a big industrial city, or at least it once was, and that's how it got its big foundation. So all those objects that speak to that, the working with the natural resources, whether it be iron and steel or farming and that sort of thing, and the river in this case. So.
And do you sort of feel privileged to work for the Missouri History Museum? How big a deal do you think that is?
Absolutely, it's a wonderful privilege. Yeah, it's an amazing collection. You know, we've been around since 1866. It is a venerable institution that has taken care of the region's history for a very long time in an important way.
Andrew, what about you?
Yeah, I feel incredibly lucky to do the job that I get to do. You know, there's a lot of days where it doesn't really feel like work because we get to see the reaction from the public. We get to see the things we're creating and the things we're doing. We watch people have emotional attachments to these things and learn things. We've had people say that the History Museum is their multi-generational memory album. And that, like those sorts of responses that we see, that makes everything worth it.
You know, Jody joined us in the first segment, and the exhibits he talked about, I think sound fascinating to me just because I like photographs, and he was talking about photographs from the Post-Dispatch and from the Pulitzer Prizes. I'm sure you've walked past those exhibits and seen those. I know you're not directly involved in them, but any thoughts about what we talked about in the first half?
Yeah, the Pulitzer exhibit, it is a strong, serious exhibit. You know, we do shows of all sorts. We had a show about Route 66 a couple years ago, and it was pretty fun and lighthearted. Pulitzer is definitely a serious topic. There's a lot of images that are very hard to look at. There's a lot of things that speak to war and big, you know, national issues and international issues. But it's a very necessary exhibit as well. These things are happening in the world around us, and this captures, you know, the human experience, both good and bad, that people have lived through, and that's something I think everybody can relate to in some way or another.
Right.
It really shows the first draft of history, right? It's, you know, it's the journalists that were out there capturing images that are really iconic for many of our lives, and they're deeply moving.
Yeah. And I keep wondering, there's no answer to it, but I wonder what kind of photographs we're going to have in the next 10 or 20 years.
That's a real issue facing museums. You know, with the rise of social media, photography is everywhere, surrounding us, thousands and thousands of photos being generated every minute. How do we curate that in the future? I think that's a question that hasn't been answered yet.
You know, not all photographs are good, but maybe the fact that more people are taking photographs, maybe the chances are we'll have more interesting ones in the future because you have more to choose from.
Well, and Ferguson, of course, being a prime example, the
Yeah.
Post-Dispatch won a Pulitzer Prize for its Ferguson coverage. That is something most people experienced through immediate, rapid-fire social media photos. This stuff was coming out minute by minute. So it's definitely, you know, it's history in the making. Social media isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Well, you two are both involved in something at the museum that's related, and it's about the Mississippi River. Andrew, maybe I'll begin with you. Right in front of us is a book that's coming out any day.
Yes.
So tell me how this happened.
So November 1st, Great River City, How the Mississippi Shaped St. Louis is coming out. I've spent a couple years working on this book. The idea was we wanted to have a publication that came out alongside the exhibit David's been working on. He's going to have this 6,000 square foot exhibit that he's going to talk to you about. This book was a way to sort of capture the history of the Mississippi River and something that people could take home. The book looks at how the city and river, how St. Louis and the Mississippi have interacted across the city's history. And even earlier, we go back all the way to the mound builders who were here long before St. Louis was ever a thought in anybody's mind, when the real St. Louis was living over in France. This book looks at 56 different snapshots from across the city's history. At times, the river and city interacted. So you get things that everybody will expect to find. Lewis and Clark, the building of the Eads Bridge, the Great Flood of 1993. These were huge moments experienced by thousands of people. But then we get down into things that are maybe a little more surprising. Issues of race and immigration, and the way the river has played a role in that. Waste disposal, that's a particularly difficult story when you realize what we were dumping into the river on a daily basis throughout much of St. Louis's history. The excursion boats, the river's role in music, all these different things that have, the way the river has really tied into daily life in a much deeper way than we might imagine it today.
Your book looks interesting. It's very large. I don't know how many. I don't know how many images are in there. It's got to be hundreds.
The good thing is that it's large, but it's mostly photos, and I think all the best books have lots of photos. It's about 300 pages. There are more than 450 historic images, maps, illustrations, all sorts of different things. So it's heavily illustrated. It's a book that you can return to over and over again. It's not really meant to be read all in one sitting. It's something you might keep in your living room and read a couple chapters at a time. Something you can look back at over and over.
But David, tell me how this complements your exhibit. Will we see the same photographs, or is this just totally different?
No, it has some overlap with some of the topics we cover. So in the exhibit, you'll see the Mississippian period mound builders that Andrew was talking about. So they were the first civilization here in our region, right? They were the people that are represented by that site over on the Illinois side of the river, Cahokia. But they were all over, wherever the rivers ran, there was probably a community. There was likely to be a community, and archaeologists have found those places all through time, and many on the side of the river.
Speaking of mounds, you would know more about this than I do. Isn't there something going on right now to try to get that a National Historic designation? What's going on with that?
That's right. There's been a move for a few years, about 4 years or so, to get the mounds recognized as a national park status. So it would be a loose association of sites on both sides of the river, up and down the Mississippi and in our region, to be recognized and cared for as important to all our heritage. So the exhibit also moves on from there and goes into the historic period when the colonial powers from Europe were coming here and plying the fur trade in the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. So that's another important period we cover. Some of that's in Andrew's book as well. And the fur trade was hugely important. That's when you see the Native American groups that were here in our region being displaced, first traded with heavily by the people who founded St. Louis in 1764. And the fur trade was the main commerce in the region, going up and down the rivers. Rivers were the main course of that. And eventually the Native Americans were displaced and was settled as the states of Illinois and Missouri in this area. And then following that, we talk about the Mississippi as being the major steamboat avenue in our region. Steamboats brought industry and prosperity to St. Louis and made St. Louis grow in a phenomenal way.
Now, the name of this exhibition is Mighty Mississippi, right?
That's
and it's
right.
going to, it's a temporary exhibition, but it's going to be up a long time.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a little under a year and a half, and we did that so we could reach a lot of people. A lot of school groups hopefully will come out and see this. It's going to be core to a lot of their interests. But we're also looking at contemporary issues, so we want some dialogue in the community about how we care for the water and how floods are a major concern of ours periodically and seemingly and definitely more frequently now.
Of course, I guess St. Louis wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Mississippi, right? And at one time, that was the interstate highway.
That's right. It was the highway system for everybody. I mean, Native Americans, right through the fur trade and into the steamboat era.
So is St. Louis, is the location of St. Louis significant in any way as being on the river as part of this? Or did St. Louis just happen to be here? Or is it because St. Louis is at this location on the Mississippi River that made it significant? Is there an answer to that?
We're an ideal spot. We are on a series of bluffs. There are about 3 bluffs that you can't really see anymore, but that came up from the river at this point just south of the Missouri confluence. So the Missouri River is a major reason why we're here. The Illinois, the Ohio River. This is the hub, the center of the Mississippi's waterway network. And especially for the Native Americans during the period we were talking about, this gave them access to trade way out into the Gulf of Mexico, all the way up to the Great Lakes, up the Ohio to the east. Same during the fur trade period, and especially up the Missouri River all the way to its headwaters. And during that period of exploration for the United States, gave us a way to get to that new Louisiana Purchase territory that Lewis and Clark explored.
And Andrew, maybe you'd have a little insight in this, just how the Mississippi River has changed. It's not the river we know today. When those mounds first appeared, there weren't any flood walls or bridges or tugboats.
Yeah, absolutely. When the Mississippi River, when Pierre Laclede and Auguste Chateau, when they first set foot here in the 1760s, the river looked very different from the way it looks today. It was twice as wide as it is today.
Probably 5 times during flood season.
And floods, so the Great Flood of 1993 is famous for being the highest crest ever clocked on the Mississippi River, 49.5 feet roughly. There was a flood in 1844 that actually carried 20% more water, but it didn't crest as high because the river could spread out over these long lowland areas that we've since, sort of caged off with flood walls. So that shows you man-made controls on the Mississippi River have been a process that's been going on ever since the 1830s was the first time they really tried to control the Mississippi at St. Louis. It was actually Robert E. Lee, who later became a famous general in the Civil War, of course. He was an engineer, and he was the first person to attempt to control the river at St. Louis.
Not too long ago, I read some stories that's fascinating to me. I hadn't even thought about it. Before bridges and before boats, really, when pioneers were coming over, crossing from Illinois to Missouri, how they would try to float I can't remember details, float their wagons across. It had to have been perilous just to try to get across.
Yeah, until the Eads Bridge was built in the 1870s, your best chance of getting across was a ferry. The Wiggins Ferry Company was the big one in St. Louis. And literally in the early days, they were men with long poles that they would jab into the river bottom and push this little raft across the river.
And now we've got the Stan Musial Bridge.
Right, yeah.
We're out of time, but in 20 seconds, give me one good reason to go to the Missouri History Museum.
This exhibit is free. That's an incredible thing that we offer to the public. If you go to other cities, you're paying a lot of money to go see their local history. You can come here time and time again, and then while you're there, be sure to pick up a book and take it home.
There's always something to see. We have temporary exhibits rotating through. And we have a great foundational core galleries. It's a place where you can see regional history and identify yourself.
Well said. David, Andrew, thank you so much. We hope people will go check out the Missouri History Museum anytime. There's always something to go and some fascinating exhibits right now. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Potter, and thank you for watching. Don't forget, it's the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park, mohistory.org. I'm Steve Potter. Thanks for watching. Join us next time. Bye.